I never used to believe in ghosts. I mean, sure, I liked a good horror movie now and then, but real hauntings? No way. That changed when I started working late nights at Ridgeway Financial Services. It was a mid-size firm in the heart of the city, occupying the upper floors of an old 1,920s high-rise. The place had character. Ornate ceilings, marble floors, and dim, yellowish lights that buzzed softly. But it also had something else. Something off. And I was about to find out just how wrong I was about the supernatural. I had been working at Ridgeway for about 6 months when my boss, Mr. Caldwell, asked me to start covering some late shifts. Some files need to be processed overnight, and we're short-staffed, he said. It's easy work. Just make sure the reports are printed and sorted by morning. I didn't mind. I liked the quiet. No ringing phones. No coworkers gossiping near the water cooler. Just me, the whir of the printer, and the city lights stretching out beyond the office windows. At first, it was peaceful. Then it wasn't. It started with small things. The first night, I heard the elevator ding. Not unusual, except I was alone on the floor and no one was supposed to be in the building after hours. I peeked out into the hallway. The elevator doors stood open, the interior empty. I waited, expecting someone to step out, but the doors just closed again. Odd. I shrugged it off. Maybe someone on another floor had called it. But then it happened again. And again. Every night. Around 2:14 a.m., the elevator would arrive at my floor. The doors would slide open, sit for a moment, and then close. Always empty. At first, I joked that it was a friendly ghost making its rounds. But then, things got weirder. The office had motion sensor lights that turned off automatically when no one was around. If I sat still long enough, my corner of the office would go dark, and I'd have to wave my arm to turn them back on. One night, I got up to grab some coffee. As I walked past a row of cubicles, I noticed something strange. One of the sensors had turned on. Someone must have moved, but I was alone. I stood there for a moment, staring at the glowing computer screen in that cubicle. I could have sworn I saw the rolling chair shift just a little. My skin prickled. I called out. No answer. I told myself it was just a glitch. Maybe the system was faulty. Maybe a rat had scurried past the sensor. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. By the third week, the noises started. I'd be working at my desk, typing away, when I'd hear whispers. Soft, urgent, right behind me. I'd turn, expecting to see a coworker who had stayed late. But there was never anyone there. Then came the printer. I'd be in the middle of a report when the printer would suddenly come to life, spitting out blank sheets of paper. At first I figured it was an error, until one night it printed a single sheet with just 4 words on it. Who's working tonight? I stared at the paper, my breath caught in my throat. I hadn't sent any print jobs. The computer wasn't even connected to the printer. I crumpled the paper and tossed it. But the next night, it happened again. Same words. Same eerie silence afterward. That's when I stopped staying past 2 a.m. One night, I had to break my rule. A huge project was due, and I had no choice but to stay late. The office was silent, the hum of the city far below. I kept my head down, avoiding glancing at the dark corners of the room. Then, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I frowned and opened it. It was a photo of me, sitting at my desk, taken from outside the 14th floor window. I spun around so fast my chair almost tipped over. The window was closed, the blinds were partially drawn. But as I stood there, staring, I saw it. A shadowy figure just beyond the glass. I bolted. I didn't stop until I reached the lobby, gasping for breath. The security guard gave me a weird look. "Everything okay?" he asked. There was someone outside my window, I blurted. His face darkened. "Which floor?" 14. His expression changed to something unreadable. Then he said the words that still haunt me. "That's not possible." I shook my head. "I saw someone." The guard sighed. "Listen, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but years ago, a man jumped from the 14th floor window. Some say he still lingers." I quit the next day. I never went back. But sometimes, when I pass that building at night, I look up. And I swear, sometimes, just for a second, I see someone standing there, watching, waiting, and I wonder who's working late tonight. I never thought of office buildings as scary places. Creepy maybe, especially at night when everything's too quiet. But ghosts, hauntings, that was horror movie stuff. At least, that's what I believed before I took a job at Harrison & Co. Financial Services. A downtown office that had a dark past no one wanted to talk about. A past that, one night, I accidentally uncovered. And I wish to God I hadn't. I was a night audit assistant, which was just a fancy way of saying I handled after-hours reports. Most of the full-time employees were gone by 6 p.m., leaving just a handful of us working late. That meant empty hallways, dark cubicles, and silence, except for the hum of the vending machines and the occasional beep of the security system. My job was simple. Process financial reports, log nightly transactions, check security footage for anomalies. That last part, that was corporate protocol, a security precaution they called it. But I soon learned that something far worse than thieves had triggered that rule. The first time I felt uneasy was during my 3rd week on the job. I was working in a back office going through records when I heard a ding from the hallway. The elevator. That wasn't unusual, except for one thing. I was the only one in the building. I froze, listening. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps, light but steady, coming from the hallway outside my office. I swallowed hard. Security had already done their sweep. No one else was supposed to be here. "Hello?" I called. No answer. I stood up and crept toward the doorway, heart pounding. The hallway was empty. But as I stepped closer to the elevator, I saw something that made my skin crawl. The buttons were pressed from the inside, and the elevator was still moving. Someone, or something, was in there. But when the doors slid open, it was empty. Or at least, I thought it was, because as I stepped forward, I saw it. A single wet footprint on the floor, like someone had just stepped out. The next day, I asked my manager, Greg, about it. "Does anyone else work the night shift?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Greg's face changed, like I'd said something I shouldn't have. "No, just you and security," he said quickly. "Why?" I hesitated. "I thought I saw someone in the elevator last night." Greg stiffened. "That's not funny." "I'm not joking." For a moment, he just stared at me. Then, finally, he sighed and leaned in. "Look," he murmured, "there's a reason this place is always hiring for the night shift." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What do you mean?" Greg hesitated, then whispered, "Because people keep quitting." That night, I started paying attention. Around 2:30 a.m., I went to the security room to check the night audit tapes. Each camera showed empty hallways, cubicles, and offices. Normal stuff. Until I reached camera 6. It faced the break room, where I knew, without a doubt, no one had been that night. But as I watched the footage, my blood turned to ice. Because at exactly 2:14 a.m., the break room door creaked open on its own. And then a figure stepped out. A man in a wrinkled button-up shirt and slacks, drenched in water like he had just climbed out of a lake. His face was blurry, like the camera refused to focus on him. He staggered forward, water dripping from his sleeves, his tie half untied around his throat. And then he turned and looked directly into the camera. My stomach twisted, because I recognized him. It was Daniel Fields, an employee who had died 5 years ago, drowned in an office elevator. I spent the rest of the night digging through old records. That's when I found it. An incident report from 5 years ago. Employee, Daniel Fields. Cause of death, accidental drowning. Location, elevator 2. I stared at the report, my hands shaking. How do you drown in an elevator? I searched online. Nothing. No news articles. No obituaries. Like his death had been erased. But I knew what I saw on that tape. And suddenly everything clicked. The elevator moving on its own. The wet footprints. The blurry figure on the cameras. Daniel Fields wasn't gone. He was still here. Waiting. Watching. And worst of all, he wasn't alone. After that night, things escalated. Doors opened and closed by themselves. The elevator stopped on my floor every single night at 2:14 a.m., the exact time Daniel had died. And once, while working late, I heard a wet, gurgling voice whisper behind me. "Help me." That was it. I quit. But on my last night, as I was leaving the office, the elevator dinged one last time. I turned. The doors slid open, and there he was, standing inside, soaking wet, eyes wide with silent pleading. Then, just before the doors shut, he reached out his hand, and the lights in the building went out. I ran, and I never looked back. Sometimes, I wonder if he's still there, if anyone ever answers him, or if he's still waiting in that elevator, stuck in the moment of his death, doomed to ride the floors forever, looking for someone to help, or worse, looking for someone to take his place. I've always been a skeptic. Ghost stories, urban legends, creepy office horror stories. I never bought into any of it. But what happened to me at my old job changed everything. Because for one horrifying night, I found myself trapped in a place that shouldn't exist. A 6th floor, in a building that only had 5. I worked at Manning & Wells, a corporate law firm in downtown Chicago. It was the kind of place where the lights never truly turned off, where people stayed late, hunched over their desks, drowning in paperwork. So when my boss offered me a promotion, along with a pay raise, I took it without hesitation. It came with one catch. I had to cover aftermath reports once a week. Just a small trade-off, my boss said with a smile. The 6th floor gets a bit quiet at night, but you'll be fine. The 6th floor. At the time, that didn't strike me as strange. Not until I mentioned it to one of my coworkers, Sarah. She stared at me, her face turning pale. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. I blinked. The 6th floor. I have to do reports up there on Tuesdays. Sarah shook her head slowly. This building only has 5 floors. That Tuesday, I took the elevator up after everyone had left for the night. I pressed the button for the 6th floor, expecting something, anything, to stop me. But the elevator moved. Slowly. Silently. When the doors opened, I stepped into a dimly lit hallway that smelled like dust and old paper. Cubicles stretched out before me, each one perfectly arranged. But wrong. The desks were too old. The computers were outdated. Monitors from the early 2000s. And the phones, they all had cords, coiled like dead snakes. The air felt stale, like no one had worked here in decades. And yet, a lamp was on at one of the desks, like someone had been expecting me. I approached the desk cautiously. The old landline phone suddenly rang, shrill and jarring in the silence. I froze. No one was supposed to be up here. Slowly, I picked it up. "Hello?" I whispered. Static. And then, a voice crackled through the line. "You shouldn't be here." I slammed the phone down and spun around. And that's when I saw them. Figures. standing at the far end of the hallway, not moving, not blinking, just watching me. My blood turned to ice. The figures were shadowy, but I could make out details. Old suits, outdated ID badges, lifeless gray eyes. And the longer I stared, the more I recognized them, because I had seen their photos before, in a memorial frame on the first floor. They were employees who had died in a building fire decades ago, right here on the 6th floor. A floor that, according to everyone I worked with, didn't exist anymore. I bolted for the elevator, slamming the button frantically. The doors opened and I rushed inside. But just as they started to close, I saw something that nearly stopped my heart. One of them was inside with me. A woman in a burnt office dress, her skin charred and peeling, her ID badge melted into her chest. And worst of all, she was smiling. The elevator plunged downward, but instead of stopping on the first floor, the doors opened to an entirely different office space. Desks burned, walls blackened. The air was thick with the smell of smoke. And outside the elevator, the figures were waiting, watching, and then they started moving toward me. I jammed my hand against the closed door button. The woman inside the elevator tilted her head, her melted face cracking apart. "You can't leave," she whispered. The elevator shook violently. The walls warped. I felt heat, actual heat, like flames licking at my skin. And then, ding, the doors slammed shut and the elevator rocketed downward. When they opened again, I was on the first floor. The real first floor. The normal office. The lights were back to normal, and the 6th floor button was gone, like it had never existed. I ran out of the building, not stopping until I reached my car. The next day I called in sick. By the end of the week, I had quit. I never went back. But before I left for good, I did one last thing. I researched the building's history, and what I found still haunts me. Decades ago, the 6th floor was completely destroyed in a fire. They never rebuilt it. But somehow, I had been there. I had seen them. And I knew, deep in my soul, they had seen me too. I don't know why the elevator took me there, or why I was able to leave when so many others hadn't. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those trapped employees, stuck on a floor that doesn't exist, forever waiting. And I pray they never find their way back down, because if they do, they'll be looking for replacements. Thank you for joining me on this terrifying journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales of the paranormal.